Some nights, even the most successful people find themselves standing alone in the cold, wondering if they chose the wrong path. Elena Voss had everything money could buy, but on Christmas Eve at a small-town bus stop, she felt emptier than ever. The CEO had missed her train after another business call and now sat beside Marco, a single father whose gentle eyes carried years of struggle. His daughter Rosie offered Elena a handmade paper angel, whispering that she looked lonely. When the next bus was delayed by heavy snow, Marco looked at Elena with quiet desperation and said something that would change both their lives. "We need a home, and you need a man." What started as an awkward encounter between two strangers became a night that would force Elena to choose between the empire she built and the family she never knew she needed. Can a woman who spent decades building walls around her heart really learn to love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The paper angel felt impossibly delicate in Elena's gloved hands, its construction paper edges softened by a child's careful folding. She turned it slowly, studying the crayon details, a crooked halo in golden yellow, a smile drawn with the earnestness only children possess. When had anyone last given her something made with such pure intention? "Her name is Hope," Rosie said softly, settling closer to Elena on the wooden bench. "I made lots of them at school, but this one's special. Mrs. Henderson said we should give our best angel to someone who needs Christmas magic." Elena's throat tightened unexpectedly. At 42, she commanded boardrooms filled with seasoned executives, negotiated million-dollar acquisitions before breakfast, and had built Voss Enterprises from her father's failing construction company into a diversified empire spanning 3 states. Yet this 6-year-old had seen something in her that Elena herself had forgotten existed, the capacity to need something as simple as kindness. "Thank you, Rosie," she managed, carefully tucking the angel into her coat pocket. "I'll treasure it." Marco watched this exchange with the quiet attention of a man who had learned to read people's hearts through necessity. Single parenthood had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of loneliness, the way it settled into a person's shoulders like winter cold that never quite left. This woman, Elena, she'd introduced herself, carried that particular brand of isolation that came from success achieved at the cost of connection. "She doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly," he said, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of someone who worked outdoors in mountain weather. "Rosie's got a gift for seeing people clearly." Elena studied Marco's face in the amber glow of the streetlight. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter shared and worry carried alone. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of honest work, so different from her own manicured fingers that had never touched anything more substantial than a keyboard or conference table. There was something deeply appealing about his groundedness, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin, despite what were obviously difficult circumstances. "And what does she see in me?" Elena asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "Someone who's forgotten how to be taken care of," Rosie piped up before Marco could answer. "Like the mama bird in my book, who was so busy building nests for everyone else, she forgot to make one for herself." The observation hit Elena with unexpected force. When had she last allowed anyone to take care of her? Even her assistant, Margaret, managed Elena's life with clinical efficiency, scheduling, organizing, anticipating needs, but never with warmth. Elena couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her something simply because they thought she might need it. "Rosie, sweetheart, you don't need to," Marco began, but Elena held up a gentle hand. "No, she's right," Elena said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "I have spent a lot of time building nests for other people." The truth was more complicated than she was willing to admit to these strangers. Elena had indeed built an empire, but it was constructed on the foundation of her grandmother's love, love she'd taken for granted until it was gone. Rose Voss had been the only person who'd ever seen Elena for who she truly was, not for what she could achieve or acquire. This very town, Pine Ridge, had been Elena's refuge during childhood summers, a place where her grandmother's gentle wisdom had shaped her understanding of what mattered. But that was before Elena's parents died in a car accident when she was 25. Before she inherited a failing business and the crushing weight of preserving her family's legacy. Before she learned that survival sometimes meant building walls so high that even love couldn't scale them. The locket at her throat, her grandmother's locket, the only piece of jewelry she wore consistently, seemed to grow heavier with memory. Rose Voss had pressed it into Elena's hands the last time they'd spoken, 3 days before the pneumonia took her. "Remember, darling," she'd whispered, "success without love is just expensive loneliness." Elena had understood the words intellectually, but had never felt their truth until this moment, sitting on a bench in her grandmother's town with strangers who saw her more clearly than people who'd known her for years. "Are you visiting family for Christmas?" Marco asked, his tone carefully neutral. He'd learned not to pry too deeply into other people's business, but something about Elena's presence here felt intentional, as if Pine Ridge had called her back for a reason. "Not exactly," Elena replied, unconsciously touching the locket. "My grandmother used to live here, Rose Voss. I was supposed to pass through on business, but—" She gestured vaguely at the swirling snow. "Plans changed." Marco's expression shifted immediately. "Rose was your grandmother? Mrs. Rose, who lived in the blue house on Maple Street. You knew her?" "Knew her. She practically raised half this town," Marco said, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. "When my wife got sick, your grandmother brought us meals every Tuesday for 6 months. Never made a big show of it, just appeared at our door with a casserole and that smile of hers. After Sarah died, Mrs. Rose helped me figure out how to braid Rosie's hair properly." Rosie nodded enthusiastically. "Grandma Rose taught Daddy how to make my lunches look pretty. She said presentation matters, even for peanut butter sandwiches." Elena felt something crack open in her chest. Her grandmother had continued to mother this town long after Elena had stopped visiting, long after Elena had become too busy building her empire to spend summers in Pine Ridge. Rose had been here, creating the kind of connections Elena had forgotten how to make, while Elena had been in boardrooms, convincing herself that quarterly reports were more important than Christmas dinners. "The house has been empty for 3 years now," Marco continued gently. "I've been keeping an eye on it, making sure the pipes don't freeze and the roof holds. Seemed like the least I could do for everything she gave us. There's been talk about what might happen to it, but—" He trailed off, clearly uncertain how much to share about the town's concerns. Elena could fill in the blanks. Small towns like Pine Ridge thrived on the continuity of families, the passing down of homes and traditions. An empty house was a wound that never quite healed. "I should have come back sooner," Elena admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I should have been here when she needed me." "Your grandmother understood," Marco said with quiet certainty. "She talked about you all the time. Always said you were out there fighting battles that needed fighting, making sure other people had good jobs and secure futures. She was proud of what you built. But she was alone when she died." "No," Rosie said firmly, with the absolute conviction children bring to important truths. "Grandma Rose was never alone. The whole town loved her. Mrs. Patterson was with her at the hospital, and Mr. Chen from the grocery store visited every day. Love doesn't disappear just because someone goes away for work." The simple wisdom of it struck Elena silent. This child, who had never known abundance in material terms, understood something about wealth that Elena had forgotten. Love multiplied when shared rather than diminished. Her grandmother's legacy wasn't the empty house on Maple Street, it was the network of care she'd woven throughout this community. The way she'd taught a grieving widower to braid his daughter's hair, the Tuesday casseroles that said "you matter" more clearly than any words. "I work 3 jobs, Marco said quietly, his gaze fixed on his daughter rather than Elena. Morning shift at the lumber mill, afternoons at Johnson's Auto Repair, evenings cleaning the bank building. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and it keeps Rosie fed and clothed and in a decent school. Elena heard the pride beneath the admission, the way he claimed his circumstances without shame, while making it clear that his daughter's needs came first, always. It was a foreign concept to her, this complete subsumation of personal ambition to love. In Elena's world, success meant climbing higher, acquiring more, expanding influence. Marco's success was measured in his daughter's laughter, her confidence, her ability to see angels where others saw only strangers. "What happened to your wife?" Elena asked gently, recognizing the shadow that crossed Marco's features whenever he mentioned her. "Cancer," he said simply. Sarah was 28 when Rosie was born, 31 when the doctors found it, 33 when she died. 2 years of fighting, 2 years of hoping every treatment would be the one that worked. The medical bills ate through everything we'd saved and more, but we'd do it again in a heartbeat if it meant one more day with her. "I'm sorry," Elena said, and meant it in a way that surprised her with its depth. That must have been incredibly difficult. "The hardest part wasn't losing Sarah," Marco continued, his voice steady but soft. "The hardest part was figuring out how to be enough for Rosie when I felt broken myself. How do you teach someone to dream when your own dreams just died? How do you promise them the world will be kind when it's just proved how cruel it can be?" Rosie leaned against her father's side, her small hand finding his. "Daddy figured it out," she said with absolute faith. "He said Mama's love didn't go away, it just got bigger so it could fit around both of us, even when she wasn't here anymore." Elena watched this exchange with something approaching awe. Here was grief transformed into wisdom, loss alchemied into deeper love. Marco had done what Elena had never learned. He'd let his heart break, and then chosen to let it heal, not by closing off, but by opening wider. The snow continued to fall around them, each flake catching the streetlight like tiny stars. In the distance, Elena could see the warm glow of windows in small houses, families gathering for Christmas Eve dinners, children probably peering out at the storm with excitement rather than frustration. This was the world her grandmother had inhabited, a world where people mattered more than profits, where connection trumped achievement, where love was measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away. "We need a home," Marco had said earlier, and Elena was beginning to understand the full weight of those words. They weren't just talking about shelter or financial security. They were talking about the kind of home Elena had once known in her grandmother's house, a place where you belonged not because of what you could provide, but because of who you were, where your presence was gift enough. And his other words, "You need a man," carried their own truth, though not in any way Elena might have expected. She didn't need someone to take care of her financially or professionally. But she was beginning to realize she might need someone to remember with her that success was meaningless without someone to share it with. Someone who could see past her achievements to the woman who once made snow angels and believed in Christmas magic. The bus shelter felt like a cocoon around the three of them, protection against more than just the storm. Elena found herself reluctant to check her phone, to reconnect with the urgent emails and pressing decisions that usually defined her existence. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she needed to be, even if she couldn't yet understand why. "Tell me about your favorite Christmas," she said to Rosie, settling back against the bench as if she had all the time in the world. For tonight, perhaps she did. The bus schedule posted behind scratched plexiglass became Elena's unwelcome messenger of fate. She read the yellow notice 3 times before the words fully registered. "Due to severe weather conditions, all bus service suspended until further notice. Passengers are advised to seek alternative transportation or accommodations." "No, no, no," Elena muttered, pulling out her phone with fingers that had gone numb from more than just the cold. The screen showed 17 missed calls and 43 unread messages, each notification a reminder of the carefully orchestrated world she'd left spinning without her. The Hartwell merger was supposed to close tomorrow, Christmas Day, at the insistence of their German partners who didn't observe the holiday. Her presence wasn't just expected, it was contractually required. Marco watched her panic with the calm recognition of someone who had learned that some storms simply had to be weathered. "The mountain roads are probably closed too," he said gently. "When Pine Ridge gets snowed in, we really get snowed in, sometimes for days." "Days?" Elena's voice cracked on the word. "I can't be stuck here for days. I have responsibilities, commitments. There's a $40 million deal that depends on my signature tomorrow morning." Rosie looked up from where she'd been making small snowballs beside the bench. "Maybe the money can wait," she said with the simplicity that only children could manage. "Christmas can't wait. It only comes once a year." Elena stared at this small person who had just dismissed $40 million as if it were pocket change. In Rosie's universe, Christmas held more weight than quarterly projections, more urgency than corporate deadlines. The contrast struck Elena as both absurd and deeply unsettling. "I need to make some calls," Elena said, stepping away from the bench to pace the small shelter. Her first call went to Margaret, her assistant, whose efficiency had saved Elena countless times before. "Elena, thank God." Margaret's voice crackled through the poor reception. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. The Hartwell people are getting nervous, and Mr. Richardson from the board has called twice, asking about contingency plans. Get me on the first flight out of." Elena paused, realizing she didn't even know where the nearest airport was. "Margaret, where's the closest airport to Pine Ridge?" "Montana." "Let me check." The sound of rapid typing filled the pause. "Billings is about 3 hours by car, assuming the roads are clear." "But Elena, I'm looking at weather reports, and it's not good. They're calling this the worst Christmas Eve storm in 30 years. Everything's grounded." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her meticulously planned life collapsing like a house of cards. "Then charter something. Helicopter. Private jet. I don't care what it costs. I'll try, but—" The call dropped. Elena stared at her phone, watching the signal bars flicker between none and one. Even her connection to the outside world was being severed by this place that seemed determined to hold her captive. "Storms like this, cell towers go down too," Marco said quietly. He'd moved closer, his tone gentle but matter-of-fact. "Mountain weather doesn't negotiate with schedules." "You don't understand," Elena said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay composed. "This isn't just about money. This deal will save 300 jobs in Detroit, secure pension funds for thousands of families. People are counting on me." Marco nodded slowly, his understanding deeper than Elena realized. "I know about people counting on you. I live it every day. But sometimes the best thing you can do for people is to be where you are, fully present." "Easy for you to say. Your 3 jobs will still be there after Christmas. My deal won't be." The words escaped before Elena could stop them, harsh in the winter air. She immediately regretted their sharp edge, saw how they landed on Marco like a slap. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes withdrew, a door closing quietly but firmly. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't understand your world, but I understand what it means to have everything you've worked for hanging by a thread." Rosie moved between them with the instinctive diplomacy of a child who had learned to read adult tension. "The diner's still open," she announced, pointing across the street to a building glowing with warm yellow light. "Mrs. Chen makes the best hot chocolate in Montana. She puts marshmallows and cinnamon, and sometimes she lets me help stir." Elena followed Rosie's pointing finger and saw refuge. Murphy's Diner, a narrow building wedged between a hardware store and a used bookshop, its windows fogged with warmth and decorated with paper snowflakes. Through the glass, she could make out the shapes of other stranded travelers, the comforting bustle of people making the best of unexpected circumstances. "At least it's warm," Marco offered, his earlier hurt tucked away with the grace of someone who couldn't afford to hold grudges. "And Mrs. Chen's got a phone behind the counter. Landline. Might have better luck reaching your people." Elena looked at her phone again, its screen now showing no signal at all. The device that usually connected her to global markets, international conferences, and billion-dollar opportunities had become as useful as a paperweight. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, in the hometown of the woman who had taught her about what truly mattered, and all her sophisticated technology couldn't compete with the simple reality of snow and wind. "I suppose I don't have much choice," she said, trying to maintain some dignity in her surrender to circumstances beyond her control. "None of us do," Marco replied, but his tone had warmed again. "That's not always a bad thing." They gathered their belongings, Elena's expensive leather briefcase, looking out of place beside Marco's worn backpack, and Rosie's small pink suitcase covered in princess stickers. As they prepared to cross the street, Elena realized she was about to enter a world completely foreign to her usual experience. When had she last sat in a small-town diner? When had she last been anywhere that didn't cater specifically to people like her, successful, demanding, accustomed to having their needs anticipated and met? The wind hit them as soon as they left the shelter, driving snow that stung exposed skin and made conversation impossible. Elena found herself between Marco and Rosie, their bodies providing windbreaks as they hurried across the empty street. For a moment, she felt oddly protected, part of a small unit, working together against the storm instead of facing everything alone. The diner's door opened with the cheerful jingle of an old-fashioned bell, and warmth enveloped them like a hug. The interior was exactly what Elena might have expected from a place called Murphy's Red Vinyl Booths, black and white checkered floor, a long counter with stools that had seen decades of use. Christmas decorations hung from every available surface, tinsel garlands, construction paper wreaths, and a small artificial tree in the corner that blinked with multicolored lights. "Marco, Rosie." A woman emerged from behind the counter, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of smile that made strangers feel like family. "I was wondering if you two would make it in tonight. And who's this lovely lady?" "Mrs. Chen. This is Elena," Marco said, helping Rosie out of her coat. "Elena, meet Mrs. Chen. She's been feeding Pine Ridge for 30 years. "Rose Voss's granddaughter," Mrs. Chen said immediately, studying Elena's face with the sharp recognition of someone who had known and loved the older woman. "You have her eyes. She used to come in here every Sunday after church, always ordered the same thing, coffee black, 1 sugar, and whatever pie I had that needed eating. Said she was doing me a favor, but we all knew she just wanted to make sure I didn't throw away good food." Elena felt that familiar tightness in her throat, the way memories of her grandmother could still catch her off guard even 3 years later. She never mentioned having Sunday dinners here. "Oh, that wasn't dinner, sweetheart. That was her way of checking on folks. She'd sit at that corner booth." Mrs. Chen pointed to a table by the window, and people would just naturally drift over to say hello. Before long, she'd know who was struggling with their mortgage, whose kids were acting up, who needed a job or a meal or just someone to listen. Your grandmother could solve half the town's problems over a slice of apple pie. As if summoned by the memory, Elena found herself drawn to that corner booth, running her hand along the worn formica surface. How many conversations had happened here? How many small kindnesses had been planned? How many connections made? Her grandmother had built a different kind of empire than Elena's one, measured not in acquisitions and market share, but in the quiet accumulation of human moments, the patient investment in community bonds that paid dividends in belonging rather than profit. "So, Mrs. Chen continued, settling them at a larger table and producing menus that had clearly been laminated sometime in the previous decade. I'm guessing you folks are going to be here for a while. This storm's not going anywhere tonight, and probably not tomorrow either. Good thing we've got plenty of hot chocolate and Christmas spirit to go around. Elena looked around the diner, taking in the other stranded travelers, a young couple sharing a piece of pie, an elderly man reading a paperback novel, a family with 2 small children who were currently using crayons to color on paper placemats. Everyone seemed remarkably content for people whose plans had been derailed by forces beyond their control. "How can you all be so calm?" she asked, the question escaping before she could censor it. "Don't you have places to be? People expecting you?" Mrs. Chen sat down beside them, her expression kind but knowing. "Honey, fighting weather is like fighting time. It's a battle you're guaranteed to lose. Better to put your energy into making the best of what you've got, instead of mourning what you've lost." As if to underscore her point, the lights flickered momentarily, causing everyone in the diner to pause and look up. When the power held steady, conversation resumed, with the easy acceptance of people who understood that some things simply had to be endured. Elena's phone, sitting silent on the table, seemed to mock her with its powerlessness. Somewhere, board members were probably convening emergency meetings, lawyers were crafting contingency plans, and the Hartwell deal was slowly slipping away like snow melting in warm hands. Everything she had worked for, everything that defined her success, was dissolving while she sat in a small-town diner drinking hot chocolate with a single father and his daughter. The strangest part was that for the first time in years, Elena wasn't sure she minded. Marco's work badge caught the diner's fluorescent light as he reached for his wallet, the plastic surface scratched from years of daily use. Pine Ridge Lumber, Marco Santos, mill operator, it read in simple black letters, but Elena found herself studying it like an artifact from another world. When had she last encountered someone who wore their livelihood so plainly, who carried their identity not in titles or corner offices, but in honest work that built things people actually needed? "I can get this," Elena said quickly, her hand moving toward her purse with the automatic gesture of someone accustomed to solving problems with money. Marco's hand gently intercepted hers. "I've got it. 3 hot chocolates and some pie isn't going to break the bank." There was no pride in his refusal, no defensiveness, just the quiet dignity of a man who had learned the difference between accepting help and accepting charity. Elena studied his face, recognizing something she rarely encountered in her professional life. Genuine contentment with one's circumstances, not because they were perfect, but because they were sufficient. "Tell me about your work," she said, settling back in the booth. It was a question she asked in boardrooms all the time, but here it carried different weight. This wasn't networking or due diligence, it was genuine curiosity about a life so different from her own. "The lumber mill's been the heart of Pine Ridge for 40 years, Marco began, his hands wrapping around his steaming mug. "We process timber from sustainable forests up in the mountains, ship it out to construction companies across 3 states. It's good work, steady, honest, the kind of place where your word means something and people look out for each other." Rosie nodded enthusiastically. "Daddy makes the wood that builds houses. He says every board he cuts might become someone's kitchen table or their baby's crib or the porch where they sit and watch sunsets." The poetry of it struck Elena unexpectedly. In her world, lumber was a commodity, a line item in construction budgets, a variable in profit margins. But Marco saw it as something more fundamental, the raw material of human shelter, the foundation upon which families built their lives. "What about the auto repair shop?" Elena asked. "Johnson's place has been in his family for 3 generations, Marco replied. "I work afternoons there, mostly doing oil changes and tire rotations, but Mr. Johnson's been teaching me engine work, says I have good hands for it." He looked down at those hands, calloused and scarred from honest labor. It's satisfying work, fixing things that are broken, keeping people's cars running so they can get to work, take their kids to school. Elena thought of her own manicured hands, soft from office work and spa treatments. When had she last fixed anything herself? When had she last created something tangible, something that would outlast the quarterly report or the budget presentation? And the evening job? Cleaning the First National building downtown. Not glamorous, but it pays well, and I can bring Rosie with me during school breaks. She does her homework at one of the desks while I work. Marco's smile was gentle as he looked at his daughter. She's probably the only 6-year-old in Montana who knows how to properly clean Venetian blinds. I'm very good at it, Rosie said proudly. Daddy says attention to detail is important, no matter what job you're doing. Even if no one else will notice, you'll know if you did your best or not. The simple wisdom of it made Elena's chest tight. Here was a man working 3 jobs, not out of ambition but out of love, teaching his daughter that dignity came from effort rather than outcome, that work was meaningful when it served something larger than oneself. It must be exhausting, Elena said softly. Marco shrugged. Some days, but Rosie makes it worth it. Every job I work, every hour I put in, it's all for her future. So she can go to college if she wants, or start her own business, or travel the world, whatever makes her happy. What makes you happy? Elena asked, the question surprising them both. Marco considered this seriously, his gaze moving to his daughter and then out the window, where snow continued to fall in the amber glow of streetlights. Watching Rosie grow up strong and kind. Knowing that even though her mother isn't here to see it, she'd be proud of the little girl we're raising together. Having work that matters, even if it's not what other people might call important. Coming home to our little apartment and making dinner together, hearing about her day at school. Elena tried to remember the last time someone had asked her what made her happy. In her world, happiness was assumed to be synonymous with success, bigger deals, larger acquisitions, increased market share. But when had she last felt the simple contentment Marco described? What about you? Rosie asked, with the directness children brought to important questions. What makes you happy? Elena opened her mouth to give the standard answer, the thrill of closing a deal, the satisfaction of building something lasting, the pride of employing thousands of people. But sitting in this warm diner with snow falling outside and 2 people who had shown her more genuine kindness in one evening than she'd experienced in months, those answers felt hollow. I'm not sure I remember, she admitted, the honesty surprising her. Mrs. Chen appeared at their table with a fresh pot of coffee and the knowing smile of someone who had seen this particular revelation many times before. That's the first step to figuring it out, she said, refilling Marco's cup. Most people are so busy chasing what they think should make them happy, they never notice what actually does. Like how I used to think I wanted a pony, Rosie added helpfully. But then I realized what I really wanted was something to take care of and love. So Daddy got me goldfish instead, and they make me just as happy as a pony would, but they fit better in our apartment. Elena couldn't help but smile at the child's logic. That's very wise. Daddy says wisdom comes from paying attention to what's really happening instead of what you wish was happening. Another pearl of insight, delivered with the casual confidence of a 6-year-old who had been raised by a father who understood the difference between wanting and needing, between dreams and contentment. Your daughter is remarkable, Elena told Marco, meaning it completely. She gets that from her mother, Marco replied, but his eyes held pride along with the lingering grief. Sarah always said Rosie came into the world with an old soul, like she already understood things the rest of us had to learn the hard way. Elena found herself wondering what her own life might have looked like if she'd had that kind of clarity from the beginning. If she'd understood earlier that success without connection was just an expensive form of isolation. Her grandmother had tried to teach her these lessons during those childhood summers in Pine Ridge, but Elena had been too young to understand, too eager to prove herself in the larger world. Now, sitting across from a man who measured his wealth in his daughter's laughter and his work in the shelter it provided for others, Elena began to see the possibilities she had missed. The empire she had built was impressive by any measure, but it was also cold, demanding, and fundamentally lonely. When had she last shared a simple meal with people who cared about her happiness rather than her productivity? Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Murphy's diner, Elena felt something beginning to thaw, not just from the warmth of the room, but from the unexpected comfort of being seen as simply herself, not as the CEO or the deal-maker or the success story, but as a woman who had forgotten how to be happy and was just beginning to remember that forgetting wasn't permanent. The drawing appeared on the table between their empty hot chocolate mugs, like a bridge between worlds. Rosie had been quietly working with crayons. Mrs. Chen had provided, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she created something Elena hadn't expected to see, a family portrait that included all three of them. The paper showed a small house with smoke curling from its chimney, a yard with a snowman wearing a lopsided hat, and three figures holding hands in front of it all. Elena recognized herself in the tall figure on the left, her business suit rendered in careful black strokes, but Rosie had added something Elena never wore to work, a smile that reached her crayon-drawn eyes. Marco stood in the middle, his work clothes detailed with the precision only a child who truly saw her father would possess. And there was Rosie herself on the right, her arms stretched wide, as if to embrace the whole scene. "That's our family," Rosie announced matter-of-factly, pushing the drawing toward Elena. "I drew you in because you fit." Elena stared at the picture, her throat constricting with emotions she couldn't name. When had anyone last included her in their vision of home? Her own assistant scheduled her personal life with the same clinical efficiency she applied to board meetings, but no one had ever drawn her into their dreams. "Rosie, sweetheart," Marco said gently, "Elena has her own family, her own life. But she's here with us now," Rosie replied with the irrefutable logic of childhood. "And she looks happy in the picture, see? She wasn't happy when we first met her, but now she is." Elena studied the crayon version of herself, surprised by what the child had captured. The figure in the drawing did look happy, not the brittle smile she wore in corporate photos or the satisfied expression she maintained during successful negotiations, but something softer, more genuine. "You're very talented," Elena said, her voice catching slightly. "This is beautiful." "You can keep it," Rosie offered, "for when you go back to your work. So you remember that families can be made of people who choose each other, not just people who are born together." The simple statement hit Elena with the force of recognition. She thought of her life in the city, the colleagues who respected her, the employees who feared her, the board members who valued her opinions, but how many of them would include her in their drawings of happiness? How many would choose her for their family if family were a matter of selection rather than circumstance? Marco's phone buzzed against the table, a sound that seemed intrusive in the warm cocoon of the diner. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted to concern. "Everything okay?" Elena asked. "Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, she's checking on us, wants to make sure we made it somewhere safe for the night." Marco's fingers moved quickly across the phone's keyboard. "She worries when the weather gets bad. Lost her husband 2 winters ago when his car slid off the mountain road during a storm." Elena watched him type, noting the care he took in his response, the way he assured their neighbor not just of their safety, but of their contentment. In her world, communication was efficient, direct, purposeful. Marco's message was something else entirely, a small act of love that acknowledged another person's worry and transformed it into relief. "She says the power's out in half the town," Marco continued, reading the response. "But the emergency shelter's open at the community center if anyone needs it. Will you be able to get home tonight?" Elena asked, though she found herself hoping the answer was no. The thought of returning to her hotel room alone, cut off from this unexpected warmth, felt like stepping back into the cold. Our apartment's only 6 blocks from here, but in this weather. Marco looked out the window, where the snow was falling even more heavily. Might be better to wait until morning. Mrs. Chen's got a couple of rooms upstairs for situations like this. As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Chen appeared beside their table. I heard my name. You folks thinking about staying the night? I've got 2 rooms available, nothing fancy, but they're warm and the beds are clean. Elena's phone, silent now for over an hour, suddenly felt like deadweight in her purse. Somewhere, her carefully constructed world was continuing without her deals being restructured, meetings being rescheduled, subordinates making decisions she would normally insist on controlling herself. But for the first time in years, the thought of being unreachable didn't terrify her. That would be wonderful, she heard herself saying, thank you. Marco looked surprised by her quick acceptance. You sure? I figured you'd want to get back to your hotel, maybe try to reach your people. My hotel's probably without power too, Elena replied, which was true but not the whole truth. The real truth was that she wasn't ready to leave this bubble of connection, this accidental family that had formed around shared cocoa and childhood drawings. Besides, Rosie made me part of your family portrait. I should probably stick around to see how the story ends. Rosie clapped her hands in delight. It's like a sleepover. Can we tell stories? Daddy knows the best stories about Mama and the adventures they had before I was born. Elena saw something flicker across Marco's face, not pain, exactly, but the complicated emotion that came with missing someone while also celebrating their memory. Your Mama would have loved this storm, he told Rosie, his voice warm with remembering. She always said bad weather was the world's way of making people slow down and pay attention to each other. Tell Elena about the time Mama got snowed in at the library, Rosie prompted, settling back in the booth as if preparing for a treasured tale. Marco's smile became something beautiful and sad. Sarah was head librarian here in Pine Ridge. One winter night, she was working late, cataloging new books, when a sudden storm hit. She couldn't get home, so she decided to make the best of it. She gathered all the candles from the emergency kit, spread blankets in the children's section, and spent the night reading stories to herself out loud, practicing for the story time she'd give to kids. But she wasn't alone, Rosie continued, clearly having heard this story many times. Tell about the surprise. When the storm cleared the next morning, half the town showed up at the library. Turns out people had seen the candlelight through the windows and thought someone might be in trouble. But when they came to check, they found Sarah in her makeshift camp, surrounded by picture books, and she invited everyone to stay for an impromptu story time. 20 adults sitting in the children's section, listening to fairy tales while the sun came up. Elena could picture it perfectly, a room full of grown-ups, choosing magic over practicality, connection over convenience. It was exactly the kind of story her grandmother would have loved, exactly the kind of moment that made Pine Ridge different from the world Elena inhabited. That's where I learned that the best things happen when plans fall apart, Marco concluded. Sarah taught me that interruptions are sometimes invitations to something better than what we thought we wanted. As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off. Emergency lighting clicked on, casting everything in a softer, more intimate glow. Around the diner, other stranded travelers looked up from their conversations, but no one seemed particularly distressed. If anything, the dimmed lighting made the space feel cozier, more like a gathering of friends than a collection of strangers. Perfect timing, Mrs. Chen announced cheerfully. Nothing like a power outage to remind us that the best conversations happen by candlelight anyway. Elena looked around the table at Marco and Rosie, at the drawing that had made her part of their family, at the gentle faces of people who had transformed an inconvenience into an adventure. Her phone sat silent and dark, her empire managed itself without her, and for the first time in years, Elena felt exactly where she belonged. The hotel room key felt strangely heavy in Elena's palm as she stood in the hallway of Murphy's Diner, looking down at the small piece of plastic that represented everything familiar about her life. Room 247 at the Pine Ridge Inn, a sterile space with corporate-grade furniture and the kind of impersonal comfort that defined her existence. Below, she could hear the warm murmur of conversation as Marco and Rosie settled into their own room, the sound of a father reading bedtime stories to his daughter. Elena had insisted on paying for both rooms, despite Marco's gentle protests. It was the kind of gesture that came naturally to her, solving problems with money, creating obligations through generosity. But as she stood alone in the narrow hallway, she wondered if her need to pay had been less about kindness and more about maintaining distance, keeping herself in the familiar role of benefactor rather than equal. Through the thin walls, she could hear Rosie's sleepy questions and Marco's patient answers, the intimate rhythm of a family's evening routine. When had Elena last been part of such a ritual? When had anyone read to her, or waited for her to fall asleep, or cared whether her dreams were peaceful? Her phone finally had one bar of signal, enough for messages to trickle through like water through a cracked dam. Elena scrolled through the accumulating crisis. Margaret's increasingly frantic updates about the Hartwell deal, board members demanding explanations for her absence, and lawyers crafting contingency plans that grew more complex with each passing hour. But instead of the familiar spike of adrenaline, Elena felt something else entirely, a strange detachment, as if she were reading about someone else's life. The deals and deadlines that had seemed critically important 12 hours ago now felt abstract, distant, like problems belonging to a person she used to be. A soft knock at her door interrupted her scrolling. Elena opened it to find Rosie in pajamas, decorated with cartoon snowflakes, holding a small wrapped package. "I made you something," Rosie announced, pushing the gift toward Elena. "For your room, so it doesn't feel so lonely." Elena unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal another paper angel, this one larger than the first, with more elaborate details. Rosie had used gold crayon for the halo and added tiny silver stars across the wings. "Her name is Joy," Rosie explained solemnly. "She's Hope's sister. Daddy says you should never have just hope by itself. You need joy too, or hope gets too heavy to carry." The simple theology of it brought tears to Elena's eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. She's perfect. Daddy wanted me to ask if you'd like to have Christmas Eve dinner with us tomorrow." "Well, today, I guess, since it's past midnight now. We don't have much. But Mrs. Chen said she'd help us cook something special." Elena looked down at this small girl, who had already given her more genuine gifts in one evening than she'd received in years of corporate holiday parties and business dinners. The invitation carried weight beyond its simple words. It was an offer of inclusion, of belonging, of being chosen for something that mattered. "I would love that," Elena said, meaning it completely. "More than you know." After Rosie returned to her room, Elena sat on the edge of her hotel bed, holding the paper angel and listening to the settling sounds of the building around her. She thought about the dinner invitation, about the drawing that had made her part of their family, about Marco's quiet dignity and Rosie's innocent wisdom. Her laptop sat unopened on the desk, her briefcase full of documents that needed reviewing, contracts that required attention. This was usually when she did her best work, late at night, when the world was quiet and she could focus on the complex details that made or broke deals. But tonight, the thought of opening those files felt like a betrayal of something precious and fragile. Instead, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's house, the blue Victorian on Maple Street that had stood empty for 3 years. Marco had mentioned keeping an eye on it, maintaining it out of respect for Rosie's memory. What would it look like now? Would the garden still show traces of her grandmother's careful tending? Would the rooms still hold the scent of vanilla and cinnamon that Elena remembered from childhood visits? Elena pulled up her email and began typing, her fingers moving before her conscious mind had fully formed the plan. "Margaret," she wrote, "I need you to cancel all meetings for the next week. Personal emergency. I know this creates complications with the Hartwell deal, but I need you to activate contingency plan C. Let Richardson handle the closing with full authority to sign on my behalf. This is a board directive, effective immediately." She paused, her finger hovering over the send button. This wasn't just about missing a meeting or postponing a deadline. This was about stepping away from the identity she had spent 20 years building, about choosing something she couldn't yet name over everything she had always thought she wanted. The paper angel caught the light from her phone screen, its gold halo glowing softly in the darkness. Elena thought about the woman in Rosie's drawing, the version of herself with the genuine smile, the figure who belonged in the picture of family and home. Was it possible to become that person? Was it too late to choose joy over acquisition, connection over control? She pressed send before she could change her mind. Almost immediately, her phone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen along with Elena's own face, the professional headshot that had been taken for the annual report, all sharp angles and calculated confidence. "Elena, are you all right? What kind of personal emergency? I can have a car to you within hours, or a helicopter if the weather clears." "I'm fine, Margaret. Better than fine, actually. I just need time to think, to figure some things out. But the Hartwell deal will proceed with or without me. Richardson knows the terms as well as I do. The board can handle one closing without my personal oversight." There was a long pause. In all the years Margaret had worked for her, Elena had never voluntarily stepped away from a major deal, never suggested that the company could function without her direct involvement. "Elena, this isn't like you. Are you sure you're not in some kind of trouble? Do you need me to send security?" Elena almost laughed at the idea of needing security in Pine Ridge, in a place where strangers offered you shelter and children made you angels to guard against loneliness. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Margaret. Trust me." After she hung up, Elena walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered street. The storm was beginning to ease, but the world remained transformed, blanketed in white that made everything look clean and new. Somewhere across town, her grandmother's house stood waiting, holding memories and possibilities in equal measure. For the first time in years, Elena wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, and the uncertainty felt like freedom rather than failure. She placed the paper angel on the nightstand where she could see it, then settled into bed with the strange contentment of someone who had finally stopped running toward something and started walking home. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of silence that only came after heavy snow. A hushed world, wrapped in white, that seemed to muffle even thoughts. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through frost-etched windows and the distant sound of children's laughter from the street below. For the first time in years, she had slept past 6 a.m., without an alarm, without the urgent pull of emails demanding immediate attention. The corporate contract lay unopened on her hotel desk, its leather portfolio as foreign to this morning as armor would be at a tea party. Inside were the documents that would normally consume her Christmas Day merger agreements, financial projections, the intricate legal language that had become her native tongue. Richardson would be handling the closing this morning, her signature replaced by his under the emergency authorization she'd granted. Her absence from what should have been the crowning achievement of her year felt surreal, like watching someone else's life from a great distance. Her phone showed 47 new messages, each notification a small crisis that would once have sent her pulse racing. Board members seeking clarification, lawyers requesting guidance, the German partners expressing concern about the irregular procedures. Elena scrolled through them with the detached interest of someone reading about events in a foreign country. A soft knock interrupted her review of corporate chaos. "Elena?" Marco's voice carried through the door. "Rosie's wondering if you'd like to come see the snow fort she built in the alley." Elena set her phone aside without finishing the messages and opened the door to find Marco holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, his cheeks red from cold and his eyes bright with something she was beginning to recognize as contentment with simple pleasures. "Mrs. Chen had coffee ready downstairs," he explained, offering her a cup. Figured you might need it before facing a 6-year-old's architectural ambitions. The coffee was perfect, strong but not bitter, hot enough to chase away the mountain morning chill. Elena wrapped her hands around the mug and followed Marco downstairs, where Rosie waited by the back door in a pink snowsuit that made her look like a small, eager penguin. "Come see," Rosie demanded, tugging Elena's free hand toward the door. "I made it just like the castle in my book, with towers and everything." Outside, the world had been transformed overnight. Pine Ridge lay under 2 feet of fresh snow that sparkled in the morning sun like scattered diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving behind the kind of crystalline clarity that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. And in the narrow alley behind Murphy's Diner, Rosie had indeed constructed an impressive snow fort, complete with turrets and a small doorway perfectly sized for a child. "It's magnificent," Elena said, meaning it completely. "I don't think I've ever seen such an elegant fortress." "You can go inside if you want," Rosie offered generously. "There's room for grown-ups if you crawl." Elena looked down at her wool coat and leather boots, clothes designed for boardrooms and business dinners, not for crawling through snow forts. In her normal life, the suggestion would have been impossible. Maintaining professional appearance was essential, dignity was currency, image was everything. But this wasn't her normal life. Elena handed Marco her coffee and dropped to her knees in the snow, following Rosie through the small entrance into a magical interior space. The walls glowed with filtered sunlight, and Rosie had somehow managed to create small shelves in the snow where she'd placed pine cones and smooth stones like treasured objects. "This is wonderful," Elena said, sitting cross-legged in the cramped but cozy space. "You could rule an entire kingdom from here." "That's what Mama used to say," Rosie replied, settling beside her. "She said every girl should have a place where she could be queen of her own story." The casual mention of her mother carried no sadness, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had learned to carry love and loss with equal grace. Elena found herself wondering what Sarah had been like. This woman who had raised a daughter to see angels in strangers and queens in snow forts. "Tell me about your mama," Elena said gently. Rosie's face lit up with the particular joy children showed when invited to share their most precious memories. She had hair like sunshine, and she smelled like the vanilla cookies she made every Sunday. She could make anything fun. Grocery shopping was like a treasure hunt, and doing laundry was like sorting magic potions. When I was little and scared of thunderstorms, she would dance with me in the living room until the lightning looked like fireworks instead of scary flashes. Elena listened to this catalogue of simple magic, each memory a small lesson in transforming ordinary moments into joy. Sarah had possessed something Elena was only beginning to understand: the ability to find wonder in the mundane, to create happiness from whatever materials were at hand. "She sounds amazing," Elena said. "Daddy says I'm like her in some ways, but also like myself. He says people don't have to be exactly like their parents to make them proud." Rosie studied Elena with the serious attention children brought to important observations. "I think your grandma would be proud of you too, even if you're different from how she was." The words hit Elena with unexpected force. She had spent years measuring herself against her grandmother's gentle wisdom and finding herself wanting, believing that choosing business over family meant she had failed to honor Rose's memory. But perhaps love wasn't about replication, perhaps it was about taking the lessons and applying them in your own way, in your own time. "I hope so," Elena said quietly. They crawled out of the snow fort to find Marco clearing the diner's front steps, his movements efficient but unhurried. When he saw them emerging from the alley, dusted with snow and laughing, his smile carried something that made Elena's chest tighten with unfamiliar longing. "How was the royal tour?" he asked. "Elena's going to help me build a drawbridge this afternoon," Rosie announced, "and maybe a moat, if the snow's deep enough." Elena looked at her phone, which was buzzing insistently in her pocket. Richardson would be at the closing table by now, signing documents that represented months of her work. Conference calls were probably being convened to discuss her unprecedented absence. Crisis management protocols were likely being activated. And yet, the thought of spending the afternoon building snow bridges with a 6-year-old architect felt infinitely more appealing than any meeting she'd ever attended. "I'd love to help with the drawbridge," Elena heard herself saying. "I have extensive experience with structural engineering." The lie was small and harmless. She'd managed construction projects, but her knowledge of actual building techniques was limited to reading contractor reports. But something told her that snow fort engineering would value enthusiasm over expertise. "Really?" Rosie's eyes widened with delight. "Really?" Elena confirmed, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Marco's expression shifted to something tender and complex. "You sure you don't have other obligations today? It being Christmas and all?" Elena's phone buzzed again, its urgency a sharp contrast to the peaceful morning around them. She pulled it out and, without looking at the screen, powered it off completely. "No," she said, the word carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. "No obligations except helping build the finest drawbridge Pine Ridge has ever seen." As they walked back toward the diner for the Christmas breakfast Mrs. Chen had promised, Elena caught sight of her reflection in the restaurant's window. Her expensive coat was dusted with snow, her carefully styled hair had escaped its pins, and her face bore the flush of cold air and unexpected joy. She looked nothing like the polished executive who had missed her train yesterday evening. She looked, Elena realized with a start, happy. For the first time in years, the reflection in the glass showed someone she recognized, not the successful CEO, not the merger specialist, not the woman who had built walls around her heart to protect it from anything that might interfere with achievement. This was someone simpler and somehow more real, someone who could find joy in snow forts and meaning in paper angels. Someone who was finally beginning to remember that success without love really was just expensive loneliness, and that it was never too late to choose differently. The manila envelope felt fragile in Marco's work-roughened hands as he stood on the front porch of Elena's hotel, snow crunching under his boots. He'd been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to claim what had always rightfully belonged to the Voss family. Yesterday's storm hadn't just brought Elena back to Pine Ridge, it had given him the courage to finally fulfill a promise he'd made to a dying woman. "I should have given this to you yesterday," Marco said, when Elena opened her door, still wearing yesterday's clothes and looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. But with the storm and everything, Elena took the envelope, noting her name written in her grandmother's careful script across the front. Inside, she found a set of keys, bound with a faded blue ribbon and a letter that bore the official seal of Whitman, AIT, Associates, Pine Ridge's only law firm. "Marco, what is this?" "Your inheritance," he said simply. "The blue house on Maple Street. Your grandmother left it to you, along with everything in it. I've been taking care of it since she passed, keeping it ready for when you came home." Elena stared at the keys, their metal surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. The grandmother's will. She had been so overwhelmed by grief 3 years ago, so consumed by keeping her business empire stable after the emotional devastation of loss, that she had let lawyers handle the estate without fully reviewing the details. She had assumed everything had been sold, the proceeds donated to charity as she'd requested for any items of no sentimental value. "I don't understand. The lawyers told me the house had been disposed of, according to my grandmother's wishes." Marco's expression grew gentle but firm. "Your grandmother's will was very specific. The house was to be held in trust until you were ready to return to Pine Ridge. She seemed to think you'd need it someday, even if you didn't know it yet." Elena unfolded the letter with trembling fingers, recognizing the legal language that had once been her native tongue, but now felt foreign and distant. The document was clear. Rose Voss had left detailed instructions that her granddaughter should inherit the family home. but only when Elena chose to return to Pine Ridge of her own accord, not out of obligation or duty. "She was waiting for me to choose this place," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her like warmth. "She knew I'd have to find my own way back. She always said you were the smartest person she knew, but that you were so busy being smart about business, you sometimes forgot to be wise about life. She figured when you were ready to remember the difference, you'd find your way home." Elena looked up from the legal documents to find Marco watching her with an expression of profound tenderness. "You've been maintaining my grandmother's house for 3 years? Why?" "Because she asked me to, and because—" Marco paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because she talked about you all the time. About the little girl who used to help her bake cookies and tend the garden, who asked endless questions about how things grew and why people needed each other. She said you'd forgotten that version of yourself, but it was still there, waiting." The weight of this revelation settled over Elena like a blanket. Her grandmother hadn't just left her a house, she'd left her a choice, a path back to the person she'd been before. Ambition and loss had hardened her heart. And Marco had been the guardian of that possibility, the keeper of a door that had remained open even when Elena had forgotten it existed. "Can I see it?" Elena asked. "The house? Of course. It's yours." They walked through Pine Ridge's snow-covered streets in comfortable silence, Rosie having elected to stay at the diner to help Mrs. Chen prepare Christmas dinner. The town looked like a postcard in the morning light. Victorian houses with gingerbread trim, bare elm trees etched against the blue sky, smoke rising from chimneys in perfectly straight lines. Elena recognized the route from childhood memory, but everything seemed smaller now, more intimate. The house appeared around a corner like a memory made manifest. 2 stories of blue clapboard siding, white trim around tall windows. A wraparound porch where Elena had spent countless summer afternoons reading while her grandmother tended the flower beds. Marco produced his own set of keys, the caretaker's copies, and led Elena up the front steps. The porch boards didn't creak the way Elena remembered. Marco had clearly kept even the smallest details in perfect repair. "I hope you don't mind," Marco said as he unlocked the front door. "I've made some updates over the years. Nothing major, just maintenance and small improvements I thought your grandmother would have wanted." The door opened to reveal rooms that were both exactly as Elena remembered and somehow transformed. The hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polish, the walls showed evidence of careful repainting, and every surface was free of the dust and neglect that should have accumulated over 3 years of emptiness. But more than the physical maintenance, the house felt alive. Fresh flowers, winter arrangements of pine and holly graced the mantelpiece. The old piano in the living room was tuned, and sheet music sat ready on the bench. In the kitchen, Elena opened the refrigerator to find it stocked with basics: milk, eggs, bread, the makings of simple meals. "Marco, this is incredible. But how did you afford all this maintenance? The utilities alone must cost—" "Your grandmother set up a trust fund for house expenses," Marco explained, his cheeks coloring slightly. "But that only covered so much. The rest—" He shrugged. "It felt like the right thing to do. She gave our family so much when Sarah was sick. This was the least I could do in return." Elena moved through the rooms slowly, her fingers trailing along surfaces that held decades of family history. In her grandmother's bedroom, the quilt Elena remembered from childhood was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. In the study, Rose's books lined the shelves exactly as Elena remembered, but they showed signs of recent reading, bookmarks in various volumes, reading glasses on the desk. "You've been reading her books," Elena observed. Marco nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Sometimes, when I was here doing maintenance, I'd pick up one of her novels." She had incredible taste in literature. "I learned more about life from those books than I did in 4 years of high school." The image of Marco sitting in her grandmother's chair, reading by lamplight while ensuring the house remained ready for Elena's return, brought tears to her eyes. This man had spent 3 years being the grandson Rose had lost, maintaining not just a building but a legacy of love and care. In the kitchen, Elena found evidence of something that made her breath catch. Children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, small handprints in what looked like finger paint on construction paper, a height chart penciled on the doorframe with Rosie marked at various intervals. "I hope you don't mind," Marco said quickly, seeing her discover these traces of his daughter's presence. "Sometimes I'd bring Rosie when I was working on projects. She loved helping in the garden, and the house felt too quiet without." He trailed off, then started again. "Your grandmother always said houses needed children's laughter to stay healthy." Elena traced one of Rosie's handprints with her finger, imagining the little girl who had given her paper angels playing in these rooms, bringing life to spaces that had known too much silence. "I think my grandmother would have loved that." "There's something else," Marco said, his voice careful. "In your grandmother's bedroom, in the top drawer of her dresser. She left something specific for when you came back." Elena climbed the familiar stairs, her hand trailing along the banister Marco had obviously refinished. In her grandmother's room, she opened the dresser drawer to find a small wooden box she recognized from childhood, the place where Rose had kept her most precious treasures. Inside was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting, dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, it means you've finally chosen to come home. I always knew you would, when the time was right. The house is yours, as it should be, but more than that, it's your foundation for whatever comes next. You've built an empire with your mind and your will, but now it's time to build a home with your heart. I've watched you become the most successful woman I know, but I've also watched you forget the most important lesson I tried to teach you, that success without love is just another form of failure. You have the chance now to choose differently, to build something that will outlast any business deal or corporate achievement. Marco has been my hands and heart in caring for this place. He understands what homes are meant to be. Trust him. More than that, let him trust you. Some families are born, and some are chosen. The best ones are both. All my love, always and forever, Grandma Rose." Elena sank onto the bed, the letter trembling in her hands. Her grandmother had orchestrated this moment with the same careful planning Elena brought to corporate acquisitions. But with one crucial difference, Rose had planned for love instead of profit, for connection instead of control. Through the bedroom window, Elena could see Marco in the backyard, checking the fence that separated the property from the alley where children built snow forts. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this space, who had earned his place through years of quiet service. For 3 years, he had been the keeper of her inheritance, the guardian of her grandmother's legacy, the bridge between who Elena had been and who she was meant to become. And now, with Christmas morning lights streaming through windows he had kept clean, and a house he had kept ready, Elena finally understood what her grandmother had known all along. Some gifts were worth waiting for, some homes had to be chosen rather than inherited, and sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that felt less like choices and more like coming home. Christmas morning gifts lay scattered across the coffee table in Elena's grandmother's living room, like promises made tangible. The 3 of them had gravitated naturally to this space after Mrs. Chen's Christmas breakfast, carrying with them the simple presents they had managed to find or create in a small town on a holiday morning. Elena held Rosie's latest creation, a hand-drawn deed to a corner of the snow fort, complete with official-looking stamps made from bottle caps dipped in red crayon. The document declared Elena honorary Queen of the North Tower and granted her lifetime privileges, including but not limited to hot chocolate consultations, snowball fight advisory positions, and unlimited hugs upon request. "This is the most important document anyone has ever given me," Elena said, meaning it completely. In her briefcase upstairs sat contracts worth hundreds of millions, agreements that moved markets and changed industries. But this crayon-inscribed paper felt more valuable than all of them combined. Marco's gift to Elena had been simpler, but no less profound. a small potted pine tree, barely a foot tall, with a note explaining that he'd grown it from a seed that had fallen in her grandmother's garden. "For new beginnings," the note read, "and for remembering that the strongest things start small." Elena's gifts had been hastily improvised. She'd given Rosie a locket from her own jewelry collection, a simple silver piece that the child had immediately filled with a photo of her mother, and she'd offered Marco something that had surprised them both: the deed to her grandmother's house, with both their names listed as co-owners. "I can't accept this," Marco had protested, but Elena had been firm. "My grandmother left me this house, but you're the one who made it a home. Besides," she'd added with a smile that felt both nervous and determined, "I think she always intended for it to be shared." Now, as afternoon light slanted through windows Marco had kept spotless for 3 years, Elena faced the reality of what she was contemplating. Her phone lay silent by choice rather than circumstance. She had turned it back on briefly to find 127 new messages, then switched it off again, without reading them. The corporate world that had defined her existence was spinning on without her, and for the first time in her adult life, that felt like freedom rather than failure. "I need to tell you both something," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape everything. "I've been thinking about staying in Pine Ridge, not just for a few days, but permanently." Rosie's face lit up with pure joy, but Marco's expression grew complex, tinged with something that looked like fear alongside hope. "Elena," Marco said carefully, "this is a big decision. Your whole life is back in the city, your business, your career, everything you've built." "Is it though?" Elena asked, surprised by her own certainty. "I've spent 20 years building an empire, but I'm not sure I've spent a single day building a life. Yesterday, when I was trapped at that bus stop, I felt more alive than I have in years. And today, sitting in this house my grandmother loved, with people who see me as more than just my professional achievements, this feels more like home than anywhere I've lived as an adult." She stood and walked to the window that overlooked the garden, where Rosie had been playing earlier, leaving small boot prints in snow that covered her grandmother's dormant flower beds. "I keep thinking about what you said about your wife, Marco, about how she could turn ordinary moments into magic. My grandmother had that same gift, and I lost it somewhere along the way. But being here with you and Rosie, I feel like I'm remembering how to find wonder in simple things." Marco joined her at the window, his presence steady and warm beside her. "What about your company? The people who depend on you?" "I have excellent people working for me. The company will survive without my daily oversight. It might even thrive. I've been so focused on being indispensable that I forgot the goal should be building something that can succeed without me." Elena turned to face him, her heart beating faster as she prepared to voice the deeper truth. "Besides, I think I've found something more important to build." "What's that?" Marco asked softly. "A family," Elena said simply. "Not the kind you're born into, but the kind you choose, the kind that chooses you back." Rosie appeared between them, with the sudden materialization children perfected, wrapping her arms around both their waists. "Does this mean you're staying? Really staying?" Elena looked down at this child who had seen angels where others saw strangers, who had drawn Elena into her family portrait before anyone knew she belonged there. "If your daddy agrees to let me try." Marco's eyes held a complexity. Elena was learning to read the wariness of a man who had lost everything once and feared losing again, mixed with the hope of someone who had rediscovered the possibility of love. "Elena, I need you to be sure. Rosie's already attached to you, and if you change your mind—" "I won't change my mind," Elena interrupted, then paused, recognizing the inadequacy of words to convey the depth of her certainty. "Marco, I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on profit margins and strategic advantages. This is the first decision I've ever made purely because it feels right, because it makes me happy in a way I'd forgotten was possible." She took his hands in hers, noting the calluses that spoke of honest work, the strength that came from carrying responsibility with grace. "I know this is fast. I know it seems crazy to walk away from everything I've built for a man I met yesterday and a life I've never tried to live. But my grandmother spent 3 years keeping this house ready for me to come home, and you spent 3 years making sure I'd have a home to come to. Maybe some things are meant to happen quickly when they're meant to happen at all. Marco was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Elena's face and Rosie's hopeful expression. What would you do here? For work, I mean. Elena had been thinking about this since reading her grandmother's letter. I could do consulting work remotely, help smaller companies with growth strategies, mergers, that sort of thing. It would be meaningful work without the corporate pressure. And she hesitated, then plunged ahead with an idea that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. I've been thinking about what my grandmother wrote, about building something that will outlast business deals. What if we turned part of the house into a community center, a place for kids like Rosie to come after school, for families who need support, for people who just need somewhere to belong? Like what Grandma Rose used to do, Rosie said, with the immediate understanding children brought to good ideas, but bigger. Exactly like what your Grandma Rose used to do, Elena agreed, but with more resources, more reach. I could use what I've learned about business to help people in ways that actually matter. Marco's expression was shifting, the careful guardedness giving way to something that looked like wonder. You'd really do that? Give up everything you've worked for? I'm not giving up anything, Elena replied, the truth of it settling into her bones like warmth. I'm finally choosing everything that matters. I'm choosing you, choosing Rosie, choosing this place that shaped the woman I was before I forgot who she was. She pulled her grandmother's locket from her throat, the weight of it familiar in her palm. My grandmother told me once that success without love is just expensive loneliness. I spent 20 years proving her right, but it's not too late to prove she was also right about the alternative. Marco studied her face with the intensity of someone reading the most important document he'd ever encountered. Whatever he saw, there must have convinced him, because his smile broke across his features like sunrise after the longest night. Rosie, he said, never taking his eyes off Elena. What do you think about Elena staying with us, permanently? Rosie's whoop of joy was answer enough, but she followed it, with words that would live in Elena's memory forever. I think Mama would say this is how families are supposed to happen, when people choose to love each other on purpose instead of by accident. Elena felt tears she didn't try to hide. This child, who had lost her mother but not her capacity for wisdom, understood something about love that had taken Elena 42 years to learn. Love wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you chose to build, day by day, moment by moment, with the people who saw your truest self and decided to stay. Then it settled, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion and certainty. I'm home. As if summoned by the magnitude of the moment, snow began to fall again outside the windows, not the driving storm of yesterday, but the gentle, steady snow of blessing, of peace, of new chapters, beginning in the place where old stories had been waiting patiently to continue. Marco's arms came around Elena as Rosie hugged them both, and for the first time in decades, Elena felt the solid ground of belonging beneath her feet. She had built an empire, but she had finally found her kingdom. She had achieved success, but she had finally discovered what made it worth having. Outside, Pine Ridge settled deeper into its Christmas afternoon quiet, holding space for one more love story, one more family choosing itself into existence, one more woman learning that coming home sometimes meant discovering you had never really left at all. The resignation letter felt both weightless and monumental in Elena's hands as she sat at her grandmother's antique writing desk on Christmas evening. Outside, Pine Ridge had settled into the peaceful quiet that came after a day of celebration. Children worn out from new toys and adults satisfied with the simple pleasure of time shared with those they loved. Elena's laptop screen glowed with the formal document that would sever 20 years of corporate identity. Effective immediately, I hereby tender my resignation as Chief Executive Officer of Voss Enterprises, transferring all operational authority to the Board of Directors as outlined in our succession protocols. The words looked stark and final in Times New Roman font, each letter a small severance from the life she had built with such careful determination. Below the formal language, she had added a personal note to the board members who had trusted her with their investments, their faith, their futures. This decision comes not from dissatisfaction with our achievements, but from a recognition that true success requires knowing when to step aside and let others lead. Voss Enterprises is strong enough to thrive without my daily oversight, because we built it together to be sustainable, ethical, and forward-thinking. I leave confident that the values we've established will continue to guide the company's growth. Marco appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, moving quietly so as not to disturb Rosie, who had fallen asleep on the living room sofa after an afternoon of snow-fort engineering that had left all 3 of them happily exhausted. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently, setting a cup beside Elena's elbow. "No," Elena replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "If anything, I'm wondering why it took me so long to realize this was what I wanted." She gestured toward the screen. "I keep expecting to feel panic or regret, but all I feel is relief, like I'm finally exhaling after holding my breath for decades." Marco settled into the chair beside the desk, his presence anchoring in the way Elena was learning to treasure. "What happens next? Practically speaking, I mean." Elena had spent the afternoon working through the logistics with the same methodical approach she brought to corporate transitions. "The board will elect an interim CEO, probably Richardson, who's been my second-in-command for years. I'll retain my stock holdings, which means I'll still have input on major decisions, but I won't be responsible for day-to-day operations." She paused, then added with a smile, "I'll actually make more money as a passive investor than I ever did as CEO, once you factor in the time and stress costs. And you're okay with that? Stepping back from something you built from nothing?" Elena considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, the thought of relinquishing control of Voss Enterprises would have been inconceivable. The company wasn't just her career, it was her identity, her proof of worth, her shield against the vulnerabilities that came with emotional investment. "I think I confused building a company with building a life," Elena said slowly. "The business will continue to exist and thrive because we created something bigger than any one person. But the life I was living, that was just an elaborate way of staying busy enough to avoid asking myself if I was actually happy." She saved the document and closed the laptop, the soft click of the screen settling into place, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Besides, I have a new project now, one that feels more important than any merger I've ever managed." "The community center?" "The community center, yes, but more than that." Elena turned to face Marco fully, her heart steady with certainty. "Building a family. Creating something that grows through love instead of acquisition, that measures success in happiness rather than profit margins." Marco's smile was tender and complex. "Elena, I need you to know I'm not looking for someone to rescue us. Rosie and we're okay on our own. We've built a good life here, a simple one, but it works." "I know that," Elena replied. "That's part of what makes this feel right. You don't need me to fix anything or provide anything you can't handle yourselves. You're inviting me to be part of something that's already whole, already beautiful. That's not rescue, that's grace." She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the careful tenderness of someone handling something precious. "I'm not trying to buy my way into your family or solve problems with money. I'm just asking for the chance to love you both, to learn from you both, to build something together that's bigger than what any of us could create alone." Marco lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Rosie asked me tonight if you were going to be her new mama. I told her that was up to you and her to decide, but that whatever happened, you'd always be family." Elena felt tears she didn't try to hide. What did she say? She said she thought her first mama sent you to us, like a Christmas present that took 3 years to deliver. Marco's voice caught slightly. Then she asked if we could put your name on the Christmas stockings she made, because she wants to hang them up next year. The image of their names linked together on handmade stockings, of Christmas mornings spent in this house her grandmother had kept ready, of a future built on love rather than loneliness, filled Elena with something she had almost forgotten existed. The bone-deep contentment of knowing you were exactly where you belonged. Tell her yes, Elena whispered. Tell her yes to everything. The house keys felt different in Elena's palm now, not the cold metal of obligation, but the warm weight of choice, freely made. She stood in the front hallway of her grandmother's house, their house, watching Marco help a sleepy Rosie into her coat, while snow continued to fall softly outside the windows. "Are you sure about the timing?" Marco asked as he zipped Rosie's jacket. "We could wait until morning, do this properly with witnesses and ceremonies." Elena shook her head, her heart certain even as her mind marveled at the speed of this transformation. "No, this feels right. Christmas night, just the 3 of us. My grandmother always said the most important promises were the ones you made quietly, to the people who mattered most." They had been talking for hours about practical matters, how to blend their lives, where everyone would sleep, how to help Rosie adjust to sudden abundance after years of careful frugality. But the deeper conversation had been happening in glances and small gestures, in the way Rosie automatically included Elena in bedtime routines, in how Marco moved through the house as if he had always belonged there. "Besides," Elena continued, pulling on her own coat, "I want to do this right, not a corporate acquisition or a business merger, but something real, something that honors what we're actually choosing." So the Turnsha, in the Resias to the store, sir. Outside, Pine Ridge sparkled under fresh snow and streetlights. The town transformed into the kind of winter wonderland that existed in children's books and adults' memories of simpler times. Their footsteps crunched in perfect rhythm as they walked toward the small white church where Elena's grandmother had worshipped for 40 years, where community potlucks and town meetings had shaped the fabric of belonging that Elena was finally ready to join. Pastor Williams had been surprisingly easy to reach, despite the late hour and the holiday. Elena suspected that small-town pastors, like small-town doctors, understood that the most important moments rarely arrived on schedule. He met them at the church's side door with the warm smile of someone who had witnessed countless families choosing themselves into existence. "Elena Voss," he said, taking her hands in his weathered ones. "Rose would be so proud. She always said you'd find your way back when the time was right." Inside, the church was lit only by candles and the soft glow of stained glass windows that caught the streetlight from outside. The space felt intimate rather than formal, sacred in the way that mattered most, not because of ritual or tradition, but because of the love it was being asked to bless. "Now then," Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had guided families through every important passage life offered. "This isn't a legal ceremony that will come later, with proper licenses and waiting periods. But sometimes the heart knows before the law catches up. Sometimes families are born in moments that can't wait for paperwork." Elena looked at Marco, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. This man who had maintained her inheritance for 3 years without expectation of reward, who had raised a daughter to see angels in strangers, who had shown Elena that strength could be gentle and love could be practical. "Marco Santos," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was promising. "I choose you. I choose your daughter. I choose this life we're building together, with all its uncertainties and all its possibilities. I promise to love you both with everything I have, to be present for the small moments and the big ones, to build something lasting based on trust and joy rather than fear and control." Marco's voice was thick with emotion when he responded, "Elena Voss, I choose you too." I choose your generous heart and your fierce mind and your willingness to start over when starting over is the bravest thing you can do. I promise to love you as you are and as you're becoming, to share this family Rosie and I have built and help you make it yours too. Rosie stepped forward with the solemnity children brought to occasions they sensed were momentous. I choose Elena for my new mama, she announced. And I choose all of us to be a family forever and ever. Amen. Pastor Williams smiled at this addition to the ceremony. Forever and ever. Amen sounds just right to me. By the power of love, freely given and received, by the grace of God and the witness of this community, I pronounce you a family, not because the law declares it, but because your hearts have chosen it. Elena felt tears on her cheeks as Marco's arms came around her, and Rosie hugged them both. Outside, church bells began to ring, not for them specifically, but for the close of Christmas Day, for the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. They walked home through snow that continued to fall like blessing, three people who had become something greater than the sum of their individual parts. The house waited for them, with lights glowing in every window, ready to shelter not just three separate lives, but one shared story, one chosen family, one love that had finally learned the difference between achieving success and creating happiness. Elena's phone remained silent in her pocket, the corporate world spinning on without her urgent attention. For the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she needed to be, with exactly the people who mattered most, building exactly the kind of legacy that would outlast any quarterly report or acquisition announcement. She was home. 1 year later, Elena stood in the same spot where she had first met Marco and Rosie, but the bus stop had been transformed into something entirely different. The Pine Ridge Community Center's dedication ceremony was taking place on a perfect December afternoon, with snow falling just hard enough to remind everyone of the Christmas Eve storm that had changed everything. The new family photo tucked in Elena's coat pocket captured the impossibility of how much could change in 12 months. In it, she and Marco stood on either side of Rosie in front of the blue house on Maple Street, all three of them wearing matching Christmas sweaters that Rosie had insisted upon. Elena's smile was different from any photograph in her corporate portfolio, unguarded, genuine, radiating the kind of contentment that came from knowing exactly where you belonged. Mrs. Santos, Rosie called, the title still new enough to make Elena's heart skip with joy. They're ready for your speech. Elena looked across the small crowd, gathered for the dedication townspeople who had become neighbors, business associates who had become friends, board members from Voss Enterprises who had traveled from the city to witness what their former CEO had built with her newfound freedom. At the edge of the crowd, she spotted Margaret, her former assistant, who had initially been horrified by Elena's resignation, but had gradually come to understand that some decisions couldn't be measured in profit margins. The community center itself was modest but perfect, a renovated building that had once housed Pine Ridge's original general store, now fitted with after-school program spaces, a commercial kitchen for community meals, and a small business incubator where local entrepreneurs could access the kind of consulting expertise Elena had once reserved for Fortune 500 companies. "Friends," Elena began, her voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, "a year ago, I was a stranger, stranded in your town by a Christmas Eve storm. Today, I'm a resident, a neighbor, a mother, and hopefully a friend to many of you. The Pine Ridge Community Center represents everything I've learned about what it means to build something that matters." She gestured toward the building's entrance, where Marco and three other local contractors had installed a beautiful wooden sign carved with the center's mission statement, "Where community grows and dreams take root." This center exists because of partnerships between those who have resources and those who have vision, between long-time residents who know what Pine Ridge needs and newcomers who bring fresh perspectives. But mostly, it exists because this town taught me that the best investments aren't measured in returns but in relationships. Elena's eyes found Marco in the crowd, seeing the pride in his expression that had nothing to do with her public speaking skills and everything to do with watching someone he loved step fully into who she was meant to be. The after-school program starting next month will serve 30 children whose parents work the kind of multiple jobs that keep communities running. The small business incubator will help local entrepreneurs access capital and expertise that used to require moving to big cities. The community kitchen will ensure that no family in Pine Ridge goes hungry and that we all continue to gather around tables where stories are shared and connections are made. She paused, pulling the family photo from her pocket and holding it where the crowd could see. But the most important thing this center represents is the truth. My grandmother tried to teach me years ago that success without love is just expensive loneliness, but love with resources can change the world, one community at a time. The applause was warm and sustained, but Elena barely heard it. Her attention was caught by Rosie, now 7, and confident in the way children became when they knew they were unconditionally loved, who was showing the original paper angel hope to a group of younger children. "This is the angel that brought my mama to us," Rosie was explaining with the matter-of-fact tone she used for important truths. She was lost, but not really lost, just looking for home in the wrong places. Sometimes grown-ups do that. Elena felt tears she didn't try to hide as Marco's arm came around her waist, anchoring her in the moment and the life they had built together. The corporate world continued to spin without her daily oversight. Voss Enterprises had indeed thrived under Richardson's leadership, posting record profits while maintaining the ethical standards Elena had established. Her passive income from stock holdings exceeded what she had earned as CEO, but more importantly, her days were filled with work that felt meaningful rather than merely successful. "Any regrets?" Marco asked quietly as the crowd began to move toward the center's entrance for tours and refreshments. Elena considered the question seriously, as she always did when Marco asked it. In quieter moments over the past year, she had sometimes wondered about the path not taken, the deals not closed, the empire not expanded. But those moments were brief and easily overwhelmed by the daily reality of a life built on love rather than achievement. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret not trusting this feeling sooner. I regret all the years I spent building walls instead of bridges, acquiring things instead of relationships. But if you'd done it sooner, you might not have been ready for us," Rosie pointed out with the wisdom that continued to astonish the adults in her life. "Maybe you needed to learn how to be successful at business stuff so you could be really good at family stuff too." Elena looked down at this child who had seen angels where others saw strangers, who had drawn Elena into her family portrait before anyone knew she belonged there, who continued to offer profound insights wrapped in 7-year-old simplicity. "Maybe you're right," Elena agreed. "Maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to." As they walked toward their home, the blue house where Elena's grandmother had waited patiently for her granddaughter to remember what truly mattered, Elena felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally learned the difference between building an empire and creating a legacy. The paper angels still hung on their Christmas tree, now joined by a year's worth of other ornaments that told the story of their chosen family. Hope and joy watched over a living room, where business calls happened between bedtime stories, where community meetings were planned around family dinners, where success was measured not in quarterly profits, but in daily moments of connection and care. Outside, snow continued to fall on Pine Ridge, blessing a town that had taught Elena Voss Santos that some gifts were worth waiting for, some homes had to be chosen rather than inherited, and sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that felt less like choices and more like finally coming home.